to a tutorial on basic HTML and the creation of a first simple web page. This series will begin with these lessons in HTML itself and move forward into other tools such as CSS for styling and others over time. But before we can make things look pretty and beautiful, we need to actually simply make content. And so when we're working with an HTML file, we use the HTML specifically to describe to the browser the content that we're working with. If you've downloaded the starter files for this course, you will have come across hopefully all of these things, not the default HTML template. We built that in a different tutorial. But we have all the rest of this ready to go. And for us to make our first page, we of course need to have content, and that's what this elo1original.rtf is actually. It's your content, which you see here. And so our goal with this is that we are going to take this content and we're going to turn this all into a web page. So what you're seeing here is text content, interaction cues, and structure descriptions. And we're going to make use of all of this in our HTML. And for us to do this, I think the first thing that we should do is simply copy it all. And then we're going to put it into our text editor for our HTML page. So we will copy all that. And let's head over to our default HTML template, and we will open it with our text editor of choice, Sublime Text. And if for whatever reason you haven't done that tutorial, just so you know, I'm just going to leave this on screen for a minute and you can pause. And the first thing that you'll want to do is you want to write out all of this text before anything else. And then so that we can now use this for our purposes, we're going to save as in the location of our files, and this is our first web page. And so we're going to call this index.html because the index.html file is the file that the browser will open first in the event that someone navigates to the page. So here's our index.html file. It's worth noting that the title of your page is what the tab will show in your browser. And so this is useful for your user knowing they're on the right place, they're on the right page, they're where they intend to be. They often will barely even look at it, but if they've got multiple tabs open and they need to get back to something they're working on, this title is going to be essential. So in our case, we're going to call this The Chairs of Joe Ponte. And you'll understand why in just a second. And so this is all stuff outside of displaying this on the tab that the browser needs to know, but won't get displayed to the user. Anything that you actually want your user to see in the web page itself should be enclosed within this body tag here. So anything that's in there, your user is going to see on the web page, which right now is nothing, it's blank. And let's prove that for a second. So let's go to our file. So wherever your index.html file is, if we double click that, that's going to open it in our browser, and you'll see nothing. So it's whiteness, and that's because that's all we got. That's all there is. But we can stop that from being just whiteness. And we will stop that by pasting all that content in. It's not very well formatted right now, and there's nothing, it's just text. And so if we save this, we haven't put any HTML around it. It's just inside body, and we go to our web page. There's all the text. And so one of the things that's interesting to note is it's all the same size, and it's all just running like some giant paragraph. So why is that? And it's because the browser doesn't know what any of this is. All it knows is, yep, that's some text. It can recognize that. And so absent any other instructions, it's going to just display it as text. In our text file, we got more than that, right? You know, we've got this separated by line by line by line. We've got big text, we've got small text, we've got all this other stuff, we've got blue text, and none of that's coming through here. So why is that? Well, it's because we haven't begun to make use of the core purpose of HTML, which is, remember, to describe content and to describe structure. And that's what most HTML is. And so if the browser wants to know what, say, line 25 is, we have to tell it. And we tell it by saying, well, line 25 is a heading, and it's a big heading. So we're calling this H1, and then we close it. And so what these tags are saying is, this is the beginning of the heading 1, and this is the end of the heading 1. Anything in between these two tags is a heading at the first level of hierarchy, or the highest level of hierarchy. So we've described that for the browser. So let's save that. Let's go back to our thing and reload. Whoa, something's changed. We now have a big piece of text with some space above and below. The space above and below and the size is currently being generated by what's called the user agent style sheet. So your web browser has some default instructions built into it for how it will treat certain kinds of content in the absence of anything else, which we can see if we go to inspect after a right click and look at the core of a code. And so if I hover over this, you'll notice we've got a blue and an orange, and we can see down below here this thing says user agent style sheet and all this stuff. And you can worry about all this later, because when we teach you about CSS, you'll know what this stuff starts to mean. But the key though for us is that once the browser knows what it is, it can treat it as such. And then we can also later, in another tutorial, change how it treats it and change how it reacts to it. So we know this is a top level heading. So why did I know to use an H1? Well, it's simply a matter of deducing it from the content. We look at this document and we see that there's some headings, we see there's some paragraphs, and we see that two of the headings are the same size as each other and one of the headings is bigger. And so in this document, it looks like we've got three things that could be considered headings, and they're three levels of hierarchy: biggest, smaller, smallest. And so if there's three levels, then we use the elements in HTML that are meant for that, which is H1 through H3. So Chairs of Joe Ponte is a heading. This is a smaller heading, so we just grab that with H2. This is also a smaller heading, but it's the same size as the one above it, so that's another H2. And so again, you'll notice it's like the H2, it's not like I have to have all the H2s inside the one H2 tag. You can repeat tags or repeat elements wherever that is accurate. And then the last one, key characteristics, is H level 3. And that'll get us that. And just by doing that, if we save that, which I'll do properly instead of doing it with my keyboard commands, gets us a beginning of a structure. And then we can start doing that with everything else. So where I'm going to do that first is I'm going to do this in the little Chairs for Joe Ponte here, because it's going to allow me to show you a few other things together, including, like, there's a structure that's being created simply by the fact that the browser considers these HTML elements to have space above and below. And so it's creating line breaks where the element ends. And so that's getting us a bit of a layout structure. But we can take that further, and I'll show you that in a second. But to start with, let's mark up our paragraphs. This is obviously a paragraph of text. So we open that with a P element, and we close it with a P element. So that's the paragraph element. And we can do that to all the other paragraphs we have as well, of which there's not many, because this isn't a particularly text heavy. Well, it is, but it's not. So we've got a paragraph there. Looks like we've got another paragraph here. Oops, Automax. And that's all the paragraphs that we see there. So that's cool. So let's save that and check it out. Check out what we got again. Yep, it's just changed a little bit. Notice that the size of everything didn't change, because when the browser had no idea what this content was and just was like, well, looks like text, it was also saying, well, probably a paragraph of text. So the default paragraph type was what it was using, and so all of our paragraphs, when we make them unique paragraphs, all it's actually doing for us is creating the separation of this is where a paragraph begins and ends. So this intro section is sitting on its own here, even though in our text it's on the line up here because it's currently an unknown element, and unknown elements are considered by default to be paragraphs, so it's sitting as its own line of paragraph. We're going to actually delete this in a minute though, because what this is actually doing is it's actually going to be about describing structure. But we're not in structure right now, we're in just sort of basic elements. And so right now, if we go back to our file, we know that we've now styled our headings, we've styled our paragraphs, but we haven't styled this thing. This thing looks like a list. That looks like a list too, so we've got two lists. Each of those list content is a particular type of list. So this one has numbers, so we can consider that an ordered list. This has no numbers, so it's an unordered list. It's just stuff. So those are described in two different ways in HTML. So if we get to this list here, one thing to note is now that I know that this isn't going to be a numbered list, I don't actually need to have those numbers. Well, I'll keep them for now because I want you to see what happens if I leave them and why we're going to delete them. So a list is either an OL for an ordered list, or if we go down to the one at the bottom, a UL for an unordered list. And now that we've described that, everything inside is a list object, but lists work a little bit differently because this is declaring the content inside as an ordered list, and then what we have to do is we have to do an LI for each item in the list, because otherwise it's going to look at this and just say, okay, yep, looks like text, must be just one item, and you'll see the list probably all in one line. We're going to test it by not putting the list objects in the unordered list. So this one we've got our list objects, this one we don't. So let's save it. Reload. Okay, that's a list. That's all in one line. It's not separated. It might feel like a list to you because we've got those little dashes, those little bullets. But one thing you'll note here is we've got the duplicate here. We've got 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3. Because this one was described in the HTML as an ordered list, and so by default, the browser puts an order on it. And so as a result of that, we need to go back. Whoops, wrong thing. And we need to chop those off because the content is communicated via the element itself, which is technically true for these as well. So let's save that again. Let's head back to our file. There we go. That's looking right. That's looking right. It's not dashes, it's dots because that's the default for unstyled lists. We can change that, but we won't because we don't do styling in our HTML. We do styling in CSS, and we're not doing CSS until next week. So let's leave it alone for now. But we're starting to get a bunch of good content, and that's great. And it's all text right now, and we're going to stop it being all text because one of the other things to consider with HTML is it's also describing structure. I would also say it's describing interaction and providing the opportunity for interaction and references for where the user can go when they click. So basically anchors for user behavior. And of course, eventually, in addition to describing text, we're going to have to start describing some images. So let's get to that kind of stuff. Let's start by describing some structure and describing some interaction. So you'll notice here this Chairs Juponti said intro section. And then we've got this armchair says the armchair section. And we go down to the Superleggera, and we had a little thing somewhere in here that would have said Superleggera section, but seems to have gone missing. It's all good. So what is that helping to tell us? Well, it's telling us what kind of content this is, and we can figure that out with and describe that semantically in HTML from this. And so this is, even if that stuff wasn't there to tell us, we could have looked at the content and probably inferred that and made sort of good logical choices. So right now, if it's an introductory section, there is a semantic tag for that, which is the section element. And so if the section element begins there and it ends here, then that is a discrete section of its own. And then this thing's a section down until the end of that list. And this thing's a section down until the end of that. So those are our sections. Now, this says intro section, D156.3 section, which is, by the way, the name of a chair. It's not some special code. And Superleggera section, which is also a chair. And so one of the things that we can do is if we just name these sections, that'll help give us a little bit more separation. But one of the things that's really useful for describing structure and saying everything contained in here is part of this section is we can also use that to help people navigate to it and find it. And today we're going to do that using an attribute that is specifically the ID attribute. And so each individual ID that you use, so the content of the ID, so this thing here, this ID equals, any tag you want can have ID equals. No need to worry about that. Everything can have an ID. But the name of the ID can only happen once in a page. Probably better if that's intro, not intro. So I can't name this intro as well. It will cause problems. I can name it D156.3 because that's the name of the chair. I can head down here and make another one. So ID equals. We're just going to call that Leggera. And now I've got that as a section. And so that's cool. And now that I've done that, I can just chop that off. We don't need that anymore. Don't need that either. Misplaced that one. All good. And just so that we can better see the relationships here, I'm going to do a bit of nesting here for a second. So just give me a sec. So what I'm doing here is I'm selecting all the text and I'm hitting tab, which moves it over one. And what that's doing is nothing for the browser. The browser was going to look at these spaces and go, I don't care. But for our purposes, it's going to be handy because we're going to be able to more easily see that these two things are contained inside this. I'm going to do the same here. I'm going to take all of this stuff, I'm going to tab it over one so that we can see that relationship all the way through here. And while we're at it, let's get body. Let's get all this stuff come up. Yeah. So interestingly, we could do the same thing. So technically, everything we're dealing with here is contained inside body, and so we've already got that same thing going on. So let's go tab those over. That's starting to nest a little bit better. It's a little messed up here because something went weird. We'll fix that. So but for now we've got our sections. And we've got these labels. And to help show you that nothing changes there, let's save it. Head back here. The most movement you might see here is a little bit more space being created because the section itself might have a bit of a margin space. Let's just see that. Yep, nothing. Actually reduced a little bit. Likely because, yeah, something else was happening in terms of where the margins go. But there's our stuff, still working as always. So how useful could that stuff be? Well, it's going to take us up to the very top where we'll start to worry about that. So this thing here, notice this says link to these sections. So we've just made the sections, we've named the sections. And so if these pieces of text are meant to link us to that, that means that these are specific kinds of text. They're not paragraphs. They are anchors. And an anchor element is meant for user interaction. So these are supposed to be clickable, and when you click on them, supposed to do something. For the browser to know what it's supposed to do, we need an attribute in the opening A. Specifically, we need an href attribute. You're going to make so many hrefs in your web career. It's going to point to tons and tons of things. Oops. And there's lots of things we can put in here. We can put a web address in here, and it will take you to another website somewhere else in the web. We can put a file name in here, and it will load a different HTML file within our own site. Or we can put a pound in here, which says, look for an ID with this name. And so when you use pound and then an ID name, then the href is pointing to that line in the HTML code. And it will send the user to that line. So if we save this, go reload our page. Whoop, we've got some blue stuff now. If I click it, nothing happens because Legere is already here and it's already fully in view, so it has nowhere to go. Let's make it so you can see what happened there, and to lock in this idea of the hrefs. So let's get a few other hrefs going here. Well, let's get some content going here, but also some more hrefs while we're at it. To get you a sense of some of the different things we're doing. So this thing here says hero photo of D156 chairs. So that's an image. Text file didn't have the image in it because that would be annoying, and we can't paste images into HTML because HTML can't be anything but text. We can't write anything in HTML that isn't text. But we have to be able to have images in websites because people love pictures. They won't read forever. So what happens with HTML is if HTML wants to describe an image, what it's going to have to do is point to where the image file is. So if we have an image tag, because we can't contain an image, right? The text in between image isn't image, it's something else. So just like meta, this image element is what's called a self-closing tag, so it doesn't need to have this /end tag. And the first thing we're going to do with this is we're going to have a source attribute, which is the source of the image, and that's going to point to a location, a file location. So how do we know what that file location is? Well, let's look at our web page. Remember when we said that everything in your web page has to all exist within this one folder? So specifically, this index.html is like, okay, so I'm here, and and the text is being read from this, and it's saying, go find this folder, and then this file. So the way we would do that is img. Notice that I don't have to write like, C:\/ or anything else like that, because this file path is being read from the position of the HTML file that this is contained in. So HTML file to the image folder, which was in the same folder as the HTML file itself, and then the file name itself, which I can't remember. Something like, well, let's just go check again. Molteni-hero-1200.jpg. And if I type that right, let's save. And if there's no typos, this should work. There we go. We have a big image. We have this stuff down here. And this is helpful because now when I click Superleggera, you see that the link works. It takes us down to the content. So that's functioning. Image is functioning. This image technically is going to work just fine just as it is. We don't have to put any other text in, but to be proper HTML5 people, we're gonna. So there's a couple other attributes that we're going to want to add here. One of the first and most important is alt, the alt attribute. And the alt attribute is for when the image isn't displayed, or when someone using a screen reader can't see the image and needs the image described to them. So the alt attribute is very useful for increasing the accessibility of our content for people with visual impairments or other disabilities that preclude them to be able to see the file. And so we're going to describe it. or whatever else that might be. And then the other thing we're going to do is we're going to describe the image a little bit more by describing the width and describing the height. And this is not going to be 100% necessary now, but this will be useful later when we try and make sure that the image works and works responsively with the inclusion of CSS. So it's a 1200 pixel image width. We don't have to use the PX, just write 1200. And I think it's 765? I don't know. I would have to, let's go check. Of course, that won't tell us either, will it? Let's go to details. There we go. 645. Was almost there. Now, quick note. So for those of you who, I told you before, we describe content with HTML. We don't style content with HTML. And you look at this and you said, but you just set the width and height. You styled the content. No, I didn't. I described the content. I described the dimensions of the image accurately to what the file's actual dimensions are. If I were to change this, now I'm styling content because I'm changing the size using the HTML. If we want to change the size, we're going to do that with CSS. But CSS needs to know what's the maximum size of the image, and the maximum size of the image is the size of the file. Because if we make it bigger than its default size, it'll start to look ugly, and we don't want that. So we describe that, and that sets our maximum so that the file will never try and be bigger than that, which is good for everybody. So we've linked an image. Beautiful. There's a few other images that we're supposed to have here. We've got an armchair photo down here. We've got a header, so we've got a logo placeholder up here. Let's just randomly stick the logo in. It's not particularly important, but it locks in this idea of what we're working with. So image source equals file name of the image is logo-placeholder-100.png. Logo placeholder 100 dot. And I'm going to type this wrong on purpose. Okay? The file name matters. It should be PNG. It shouldn't be anything else. If I don't write it correctly, it's not going to work. Actually, let's write it correctly. I'll show you. I made a different mistake that you might have seen, and we'll see it better. So I've typed out the name of the file we want. Lovely. And I'm going to type the alt text, and the alt text is going to say and I'm going to set the width and the height. And we're going to close that up. So let's save this. And so I made a mistake in the file path, just so you know. I didn't put the img/. So this is going to try and find logo placeholder in the same folder as the index.html file. And when I do that, it's going to fail. So that you see here, there's that broken image. But you'll also see it says not even a log, because I had a typo, just a blank cross where the logo will be. So this is another reason to have the alt text, is not only does it show, describe the image for people who can't see the image because of accessibility issues, it describes the image for people where in a situation where the image failed to load, including us, which can be useful for debugging purposes. So don't fail to write your alt text. It sounds annoying, and it is annoying because it's more work, but if you skip this step, you will get into a bad habit. A bad habit of ignoring people who are different from you, and a bad habit of not giving yourself ample opportunity to realize what was there in a complex file. So if we fix that mistake in the file path and save our image and reload, now it shows as intended. And life is wonderful. All right, let's get to building. So I'm going to do a couple of things a little bit faster because it's concepts you already know. So one such of these concepts is tags. So we're going to call this the header. And I'm going to go down here, I'm going to end the header. So this is another description of structure. So why did I use header instead of section because even though this is another section of content? Well, because semantic tags follow this rule of use the tag that is most semantically accurate, as well as just simply the most semantically specific. And so a header is a specific kind of section. And so we know we have headers, and it is a header, so we can describe it that way. We can do the same thing with this navigation too. We can enclose this in a nav element because this is a navigation thing, and that will allow us to later, when we do CSS styling, to send instructions specifically to the design and visual layout of the navigation elements. Go down, we've got the other sections, and so now we've got those. That's the rest of that structure stuff. So let's get into some more of the content. So if we looked at this, we see a thing that says place armchair photo. Armchair photo. Interesting. So that means we've got another image. So let's continue our image practice. File location is in img /. Our file name here is d1563-onwhite-600. d1563-onwhite-600.jpg. Notice, by the way, this on white has this capital here, and so this was referred to as camel case, by the way, a lowercase first, uppercase second word, and can be another way that you can differentiate multiple words without having to have dashes and underscores in places where you're not allowed to put spaces between things, which is great. It's important that I get that capital in there, because if I don't, and I save this, and I reload, it'll work for now. But one thing you have to realize is I'm just loading this on my computer, and for some reason on my computer, capitalization in file names doesn't matter. But on your web server, it will. And so some of you will face this, because my students make this mistake every year, is they don't pay attention to their capitalization. They put their stuff up online, they submit it for marks, and then they check it afterwards when they get a bad mark and go, oh my god, all my images broke. And they don't know why. And the answer is almost always capitalization. So trust me, it's important. So let's get our alt in there. And our width 600, and our height of 420. I'm going to do another one down here. This is the Superleggera photo. MG source equals alt equals width equals height equals, close it up. And so file source is Superleggera 600.jpg. It is a 600 by 600 square image. It's a chair in concrete. So let's do it. img / Superleggera-600.jpg. I might have gotten that right. Saved it. Did I get it right? Yeah, I did. We got our images. So now we're most of the way there. We have almost all of our content described, but we don't have all of our interactions described. So there's a few last things in here to get this finished up. The first of which is we see this thing up at the top here that says caption for armchair photo. And then it has this D156, and then it also has a link. And the interesting thing with this one is you'll notice that the link goes to a website. And so this is allowing someone to go from your site to someone else's. And so there's a wrinkle. This is a caption for the image, and captions for images, or just captions for other content, have a specific semantic purpose in HTML5, and that is described with the figure element. So if any of you have ever written a research paper, you know that in the text of in the document of a research paper, if you've got a captioned image, you'll often have that image and it'll say like figure 1, this thing, and it's related to the text surrounding it. And so anything that has a caption is enclosed in a figure tag, the item that's being captioned, and the caption itself. And so the caption, the HTML element for that is fig caption, and not just caption, because this is a caption of a figure. Like that. And because it's linked, this text, if we say anchor and anchor, and to really show this in terms of good and proper tab nesting so that we continue our making this code as readable and understandable as possible, we will do it like that. So remember that an anchor has an href, and that's going to be the thing that points. And specifically in this case, we're pointing to somewhere on the internet, and so it's another web page. So we're going to just cut this web address and we're going to stick that in the href. We're going to close this, and now that caption should take us to another website. This is not only something we can do to text, we can do this to images as well. So you see this image source here. So if I have an anchor enclosing the image, then the image becomes the content that the href links, and as a result, the entire image becomes interactive. And we can click on it, and clicking on it can take us to a website. So let's save that. Let's go over and load. Page doesn't really change how it looks. I mean, this shifted over a little bit because now that it's a figure, the figure itself has some spacing, but then the image and then the caption beneath it, and notice how the relationship is set up because of the fact that they're both contained in that other container. And if I were to click this, we could go and buy a chair. Or we could click this and, oh, I broke it. The image didn't work. No! All right, let's try again. What did I do wrong? Typo. Remember, anytime that you think you did something and it doesn't work, it's probably because of that. So let's go back, reload. Haha. Now this one works too. So there's one last thing you can do, of course, which is linking to another file. And we don't have any instructions for that. The only file we've got is the default template, so we can't really do that right now. Just know that if you were to do that, you use the same sort of thing as this image thing with this file path. And so you just type in the name of the HTML file, and because you're probably going to have saved it in the same place as the other one, you just probably have that, and then it's going to work. But that we will show you next week. For now, that's the entire content and all the interaction fully described and ready to go. And your very first basic web page